Greetings, this is the Question GM. So today is RPGADay 2020 day 7, and the word of the day is couple. This is quite an interesting topic for me, I think, because I think for this particular video, I think I want to go in several directions. Hopefully, it wouldn't be too long to be contained into one video, but let's see how it goes. So first thing that came to mind when people talk about couples in role-playing games is how it affects the dynamics of the table. So you may have heard of horror stories of when they are couples playing together in a role-playing game in a group setting, and they are obviously different types of couples. Like there are couples who are both players, or they are couples where there is a DM and there's a player. So you obviously have heard some horror stories of jealousy, some relationship related issues seeping into the game, and then affecting the fun for everybody else. But in my experience, generally, I have a couple playing in my group right at the moment, and generally, I think it's fine as long as they respect that the game, especially when played with other people, is not their battleground for for relationship dynamics or relationship drama. The games where the time where they hang out with with friends outside any other social setting, and if there's any quarrels or if there's any dissatisfaction between couples, it shouldn't be brought into the shared setting, unless that's the kind of dynamic that they have with their friends, that maybe they do bring their quarrels into the game. But as long as I think that's something that other players are aware of, and there is some boundaries being set, I think in general I haven't had any problems where a couple brought something disruptive to the game. In some sense, I think it's actually kind of interesting to have players who are associated with each other, in the sense are in a relationship, because uh, it creates a different kind of dynamic, in the sense that these players want to help each other as much as they can. Uh, I mean, depending on the couple, but I think in at least in my case, I think they want to help each other, and therefore it you have a more stronger bond between these players, and therefore uh, it makes for a different gaming experience. Then there is a talk about how about couples in game. Generally, I would say that for myself, I think couples in game are a little bit more difficult to handle than real life couples, only because sometimes the expectation that we have about playing couples in a real in game generally involves an NPC, and that is something that I generally try to avoid. Do not have a player coupling with an NPC who has to be played by the DM or the GM. Generally, because I think the idea is because it gets a little awkward, and if this is something that was not done, if this was something done preemptively or improvised, it actually even gets even more awkward, and it gets even more awkward if it's the GM has to play as an NPC of a gender that he is not familiar with. So I won't get into the exact details of what kind of genders they have to play, but as long as I think if it's a gender that the GM is not in that mindset, then it can become a very awkward interaction between player and GM, and it actually becomes rather embarrassing for the GM, or maybe even both parties, if they continue on with that relationship of couple. But that's not to say that it doesn't work. I think this can still work if this is something that was planned ahead. If this was something that was discussed in a session 0, that one is the player says that I want to have a significant other in this game that I'm playing with, and something that should be co-developed with the GM to create a potential love interest for the PC. Once they get into the relationship, how can that relationship grow further, and how that relationship can affect the player character. And I think if done right, this can actually be a very powerful NPC in the GM's arsenal of creating new stories and or new situations or new scenarios for the game. My own experience with this is that I actually was in a game where I played a character uh, who actually has a love interest, and I don't quite remember if I discussed this with my GM preemptively, but in the end, I think I sort of developed that relationship with that significant other for my character, but I stayed mainly on the idea that in whatever I do not want to put uh, my GM in an awkward situation, especially since he was playing the significant other was a gender that he was not, that my GM was not. And there are definitely many ways you can develop relationships that doesn't involve flirtations. It can be a expression of commitment. It can be an act of sacrifice. It can be conversations that may appear a little bit inside jokes or that sort of thing. And there is a certain strength that comes with a character who is motivated by having someone they love beside them. Not in the case of a long distance relationship, or I left my loved ones in a village, that sort of thing. And it has definitely driven that character that I played into directions that I wouldn't have taken it normally. And therefore that's why I say that's why having a NPC couple is actually a very significant pull on the character. And it and this is something that has to be agreed on between GM and player, that there has to be a trust that the GM will not exploit that relationship. uh, you know as much as some people will tell you, like, killing off that significant other will probably be a very powerful motivation, and that can be done, but I think that's come to a point where it's being used to a point that it's almost become a cliche. And then there is that whole either idea of fear of commitment, on a player level, that players don't want to create characters that have a commitment to another person, knowing full well that the first way that the GM is going to exploit that is going to kill off that PC, kill off that NPC. And that kind of depends on the player as well, because some players take that very uh, personal on a character level. It can make for good storytelling, but I think GMs, especially depending on the game they're playing, they may not be prepared for using relationships and couples in their game as much as finding the next best monster for the PCs to kill and take their stuff. And I think for me, the surefire way to include a couple, is really to plan ahead, to really talk about this way ahead outside the session, and have an idea of a trajectory of where it's going, and how it can be used, and what are the sort of respects that both players and GM should have for each other in relations to that, whether it's an NPC, or even better yet, if it's a couple who decides to play as a couple in game. I think there's a certain amount of gratification, or there's a certain amount of fantasy to the relationship that can be added. A real life couple who decides to play as an elf and a human getting together to produce a half elf child, I think can be an interesting story in its own way. And I think there is some good instances of role playing couples. I think Critical Role has a few couples inside of it. There are definitely some D&D examples within their novel line. I think if you look at the Dritz novels, there are some inklings of couples. There are some powerful couples as well inside some of the Dritz stories. But I think the one that's very interesting, and I think the one that shows the potential of couples in a story sense, and I think you can sort of envision how this can be done in a role-playing setting, is the story of Tannis and Kitiara from Dragonlance. So if Tannis is supposed to be the player, then Kitiara being his romantic interest, being on the opposite spectrum of the war, is I think that's actually a very good example, a very powerful example of how couples can actually be used in role-playing games. That it's not only an NPC that the PCs want to protect, but it's an NPC that is also in opposition to the ideals that a player character holds, and how is that going to affect the decision making of that character in many future adventures to come. So I think if you really look around, and I think that if done with a very careful hand, couples can be a very powerful force in role-playing games. The last thing that I want to talk about, my ideas for couples, this is more of a general, broad idea, and I'm just gonna ramble on a little bit, with not having anything concrete about this general idea. Is role-playing games made for couples. I want to differentiate this from a one-on-one game where one player is assuming GM role and one player is assuming a player role, and therefore technically they are a couple. But I will be interested in seeing RPGs that are made specifically for couples or two players with one GM, so that will make a party of three. I think there are some interesting ideas or thoughts that can be had as compared to a one-on-one game. And maybe there can be very much different themes that can be explored when you have two players, when you have a two-player dynamic rather than a one-player dynamic. I haven't got any real examples of this, but maybe, you know, if you want to be really superficial about it, it can be something got to do with all your typical couple-related issues, trust, commitment, and maybe something related to marriage as well. And I think these RPGs would have to be really catered to a very specific goal or specific objective that they want to explore. I believe there's probably something like this already. You know, the indie scene is a very wide space. There's probably something like this on itch.io at somewhere. And I would definitely be interested in looking at some recommendations if you have any about RPG that explores themes related themes that can only be played by couples, or RPGs made for only two-person to play and nothing and not more than that. That's my thoughts on couples in for RPGADay 2020, and I'll see you in day 8.